Hello everyone. HTTP is a stateless protocol. That means there is no way for the server to know that some requests are coming from the same user. We need to teach it, and we do that using sessions and cookies. I am Mohammed Saeed, and in this video I'm going to show you sessions in Laravel beyond the basic. So without further ado, let's get started. To help the server know that some requests are coming from the same user, we need to identify this user. And by identifying it, I don't mean knowing the email address or the ID of that user in our database. But I mean that this request or these requests are coming from the same browser instance installed on the same computer. And we do that by sending a cookie with the response from the server. We send a cookie that has a session ID. A browser is going to store this cookie and it's going to send it with each request coming to our application. Our application will then read the request and know the session ID, and that's how it identifies a specific user. If we check any Laravel application in Chrome DevTools and we head to the Application tab and then under Cookies, we can see this cookie here. The value stored in this cookie is actually an encrypted version of the session ID generated by Laravel for our browser session. Now, each time a request comes from my computer, the Laravel application will be able to extract this session ID from the cookie and know that this session ID belongs to this user. We can associate more data with the session ID. For example, we can tell Laravel that this session ID belongs to a user named Mohammed, or that this user wants to disable notifications throughout this session. And while the session ID is stored in the browser inside the user machine, the session data itself doesn't have to be. It can be stored on the server itself. With every Laravel application ships a session.php configuration file. And if we look at the driver attribute here, we can see all the supported drivers. There's the file session driver, the cookie session driver, database, ABC, Memcache, Redis, DynamoDB, and the array session driver. The file session driver stores the session data inside a file stored on the server. The file is named after the session ID and it's loaded into memory each time a request comes in with that session ID. The Redis, DynamoDB, Memcached, and ABC drivers stores the session data in these mediums, while the database session driver stores the session data in a database table. What's special about this driver is that it stores the user ID, IP address, and user agent inside fields in the database that you can query. This is not available in any other session driver. Now let's look at the cookie session driver because it's a special one. With that driver, the session data is stored inside a cookie in the browser, a different cookie than the one that holds the session ID. This cookie, and actually all cookies in Laravel, is stored encrypted. So there is no worry from people reading this cookie value and extracting the session data from inside the cookie. What manages sessions in Laravel is a middleware called Start Session. This middleware is responsible for reading the cookie that stores the session ID, read the session data from whatever session store or driver that you are using, and then update the session data at the end of each request. Let's take a look at the handle method here. So basically it reads the session ID and extracts the session data, and then inside this method it stores the session data back after handling the request. Throughout the request, the session data will be available inside a singleton that's registered inside the container. This singleton is stored under the alias session, and you can extract it from the Laravel container. You can put data inside the session, like here, disable notifications equal true, or get data from inside the session. You can also use the session helper to put data into the session or extract data from the session. Storing data in the session is really easy in Laravel. However, you should really be careful about the kind of data that you store inside the session. Let's imagine a scenario where you store the teams that this user has access to inside the session. And then later on, you revoke access from a specific team, so this user shouldn't be able to access this team. However, when he visits the application using a new request, his session data still have this team, so the user will be able to access this team. To ensure that the change reflects correctly, we need to check at the beginning of each request that the data inside the session is still valid. So session data is not the source of truth in this case, which makes storing this data inside the session, it makes it make no sense. Just read what themes this user should have access to from the database, which is the source of truth in your application. Don't store this kind of data inside the session. Now that we understand how Laravel manages sessions inside your application, let's take a look at some of the security practices Laravel follows to ensure your data security. Starting with the lifetime of the session. By default, sessions only live for 2 hours. After 2 hours, the cookie that stores the session ID will be deleted from your browser. So new requests that comes after the cookie is deleted will have a new session ID, which will log the user out because the application doesn't know about this new session ID yet. You may configure the number of minutes the cookie should remain alive by updating the lifetime attribute inside the session.php configuration file. You can also configure the cookie to be removed from the browser completely once the user closes the current browser session. And to do that, you may set expire on close to true. Another thing you can do is to instruct Laravel to encrypt session data in the session store. That way, if someone gains access to the store, they won't be able to extract the session data. This is not necessary in most cases, unless you store sensitive information in the session and you don't want to risk someone having access to it. Only then you will need to encrypt the data. And to do that, just set encrypt to true. Another important part is setting the cookie domain. If you leave this empty, which is the default, browsers will only send the cookie that holds the session ID with requests going to the same domain that set the cookie in the first place. So if the first request went to domain.com, the cookie will only be sent with requests going to domain.com. If you want the cookie to be sent to subdomains as well, you need to set the cookie domain to domain.com explicitly. If each subdomain of your application is a different app that requires different session data, then leave this attribute empty, which is the default. Otherwise, if you want requests to all subdomains to share the same session data, set the attribute to the root domain of your application. Now let's move to the next attribute, which is the secure attribute. This one determines if the cookie should be sent over secure connections only. In other words, when requests are coming over HTTPS, not HTTP. If you set this to true, you have to ensure your application is served over HTTPS with a valid certificate. Otherwise, sessions won't work. Another thing that Laravel does is configure the cookie to be only accessible when sent over HTTP. This simply means JavaScript code running on a web page won't be able to read the value of the cookie. All cookie values are encrypted by default using an encrypt cookie middleware. This middleware is available on the webroute group by default. But still, preventing JavaScript from reading the value of cookies is an extra security that we cannot unwelcome. Finally, let's take a look at this same site attribute. By default, it's set to lax. This means the cookie will only be sent if the request is originating from a web page that's hosted on the same domain as the cookie domain, or when a user clicks on a link that points to the cookie domain. You can set this to strict or null. If you set it to strict, this will prevent sending the cookie when following links. So the cookie will only be sent if the user is inside your application. If the user is following a link from another website to your website, the session cookie will not be sent and the user will have to log in again. But this is too strict in my opinion. You should think about it a little bit if you decide to use it. Finally, if you set same site to none, this will always send the cookie even if the request is being made from a different application. I don't really see a scenario where you would want to do that, but I suggest that you read about the same site policy if you ever decide to change this attribute from the default value set by Laravel. Now, I think I covered everything there is about Laravel sessions, except one update that was made to Laravel 7.10. Let me explain this update to you. First, we know that session data is written at the end of each request. What if two concurrent requests are sent from the same user and the two requests are writing data to the session store? In that case, there will be a race condition. One of the requests will be able to write the session store before the other, and when the other request stores the session data, it's going to overwrite whatever was written by the first request. To help prevent this, Laravel introduced session blocking. This feature allows you to prevent concurrent requests in the same session. If multiple requests were sent, they will be handled by the server one by one, not concurrently, which will prevent session data loss. You can enable this feature by adding a block attribute and set it to true inside the session.php configuration file, or you can configure session blocking on a route level. Go ahead and check the documentation of session blocking and the official Laravel documentation and see if you need it in your application. Just be aware that with session blocking, the two requests will reach the server, so multiple workers will be handling the requests. The only difference that one worker will just sleep and wait until the other request finishes before it starts processing this request. That's it for this episode. That's all I need to tell you about sessions in Laravel. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments section down below or reach out to me on Twitter and I will do my best to answer all the questions. Also, make sure to subscribe to this channel so you get notified whenever I post a new video. Thank you, have a great day and happy coding.